This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by global energy law firm Bracewell LLP. I'm Herman K. Trabish, covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the series on offshore wind, we're going to talk to Stephanie McClellan, a pioneer advocate for the development of the U.S. offshore wind industry. He's going to provide historic and global perspectives on the rapidly maturing offshore wind industry, its potential, and how it can be a vital part of the U.S. energy mix. Stephanie's founder, executive director, and strategic advisor to Offshore Wind Advocate Turn Forward, and founder and former director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind. Earlier in her career, she was policy director to former Delaware Governor Jack Markell and an assistant professor at the University of Delaware. Stephanie, let's start with some perspective. What is the global status of offshore wind today?
Hi, Herman. It's great to be with you, and thanks very much for your introduction and for having me with you. We're chugging along. Offshore wind is chugging along globally. Obviously, it's beset by a lot of bad news here in the United States over the past couple of years, but in 2025, we're expecting 19 gigawatts of offshore wind will be installed globally, and that's about an $80 billion capex. So it's big and it's big business. 65% of that, what's expected in 2025, will be in China. But the others, sort of 9.5 gigawatts are large projects that in Europe, the United Kingdom, other parts of the world that are expected to reach final investment decision or be able to move forward to construction. And that's about as much as it was in 2024. So we're sort of seeing a leveling here right now. And so it's advancing. And what does that mean, right? So we can throw out all those numbers and what does it mean? It means that it's seen as a reliable and cost-effective form of power. And with that continued build out of, potentially 10 gigawatts, 20 gigawatts a year, that the technology continues to evolve and to be invested in, that the supply chain continues to grow, that we continue to learn by doing all of those things, which helps the sector and the technology to mature and for costs to come down. And
Yeah,
I'll just say that's about the fixed bottom sector. We can talk about floating if you like. It's much less mature, but just wanted to be clear that that's about fixed bottom turbines.
right. By the way, we have already done a podcast on California's
Okay,
offshore wind
right,
development
right.
and talked about the floating offshore wind turbine. But personally, I can't say enough about the amazing technology that allows these giant turbines to float. But I want to make a point or pick up on a point you made, Stephanie. As you say, it's chugging along. I liked when you said it's advancing a
Mhm.
little bit better. I mean, it's a major portion of the UK's uh, energy mix, right?
Yeah. And I don't mean chugging in the sense of belaboring or
Well,
laboring
yeah,
and trying to get there. I just
yeah,
mean, that it is moving along, right? And I guess the reason why I'm starting there is because there is so much of a sense that it has stalled, that it has stalled in the US, that it has stalled globally. But no, it's a significant part. And it's something that, is on the move. And it does not look at this point as if there's going to be anything that's going to interrupt that.
right. And China is really moving fast on it,
They are.
right?
They are absolutely, and again, 65% of all the global capacity installed this year will be in China. And it all portends well for the global industry. And so, we're happy to see that.
Yeah, and then I mean they're building the infrastructure. They're getting the lessons learned, the offshore wind boats that are needed to build offshore wind turbines and the transmission and so forth, right?
Absolutely. And that's
Yeah,
again, all of this global capacity installment just means that things will get better. Turbines will become more efficient, cables will become more efficient, installation will become more efficient. The supply chain just continues to grow and grow and grow. And of course, we want most of that supply chain for the US projects here in the United States. But as I think we'll talk a little bit about later, some of the challenges have been that global supply chain. And so this is just a good sign.
right. We're going to get to all that. I want to just before we go forward on the challenges that U.S. offshore wind faces, tell us your early work helped make offshore wind's potential much more widely known in the U.S. What led you to that study of offshore wind really long before it was an industry in the U.S. or almost anywhere? How did you get into this?
Well, a couple of different ways. I say that offshore wind landed on my doorstep, and I've always said it very literally because my husband had been involved in studying offshore wind as an academic, and really working as an advocate for offshore wind in Delaware, which is where we were located at the time. This is going back to sort of, I think, 2006, 2007. Um, and so, I have been aware of it and interested in it for a long time. But in 2009, I was the policy director for then governor of Delaware, Jack Markell. And in Delaware, because a lot of my husband's work and a lot of hard work by others, we had signed Delaware's utilities had signed a power purchase agreement with Blue Water Wind, one of the
Oh, yeah,
very
I remember
earliest
that.
projects. And so when I was in the governor's office, I sort of got tapped with being the point person for this sort of high profile energy project. And so I had a lot of other things in my portfolio, not just offshore wind, but it really did put me in contact with the network of people all up and down the East Coast working on offshore wind, with the federal government and the Obama administration working on offshore wind. And when I left state government, I decided this is what I wanted to work in. This is what I wanted to try to do. So I worked for in the private sector for the offshore transmission developer, Atlantic Wind Connection, for a little bit. But then I was recruited by philanthropy
Yeah.
to start a program, which became the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, to really catalyze offshore wind. And the task there was to work at the intersection of state governments, the federal government, the industry, and advocates to really get this going. It was 2013. It was a very grim time for offshore wind. Cape Wind was struggling. Blue Water had been abandoned. Other projects that had been proposed were failing. And so I did a listening tour of sorts and to get that program started. And one of the things that I honed in on was that policymakers really needed to know a lot more about what they could do to bring the cost down. The biggest barrier at the time was the cost. And they wanted to know what could we do to bring the cost down. And so I worked with a global network of people and here in the United States to really analyze, develop, and communicate a roadmap for cost-effective offshore wind and how to reduce the risk for projects, but also for politicians, right? They were like, we don't want to put ourselves out there and try to, and move down this road if it's not going to succeed. And so I think it was that work so what I was inspired by was, having been in government, having been in private industry, seeing the real potential and the resource that was available, and just knowing that there were these barriers and really putting, years of time and attention into understanding what could the states do to overcome these barriers, and then working with a lot of other people. I want to be clear, a lot of other people along this journey to help the state see that this was viable. And I think that work was important in doing so.
This episode is brought to you by the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, where law, policy, and strategic communications intersect to help clients navigate what's next. At Bracewell, we know energy. It's the industry we serve, the power behind big ideas, and the force we bring to every challenge. For nearly 80 years, our firm has helped industry leaders tackle high-stakes challenges with creativity, precision, and results. Bracewell's DC-based Policy Resolution Group helps clients anticipate what's coming so they can shape what's possible, from chaos to clarity. Learn more at bracewell.com/PRG.
I remember a lot of those projects you mentioned. I think some folks that were at Blue Water are now working in California to develop a floating wind. I think Google was one of the people involved in that Atlantic offshore wind transmission project, if I remember correctly. Um,
Absolutely.
but speaking of politicians, we're in that dark period. Right now, offshore wind seems to face some real policy opposition based largely on our president's experience, it seems, over a decade ago with a project that he was trying, he was a hotel project that he was developing in Scotland when he ran into an experience with offshore wind in Scotland. But that project in Scotland and those early projects, Cape Wind that you mentioned, they were near shore. They were smaller. The turbines were smaller. The technologies and economics of offshore wind have really changed in the almost 2 decades since you began your work, and especially in the last decade since the president had his run in Scotland. Tell us about how offshore wind technologies and economics have become more viable.
Yeah. Yeah, and the technology and the economics, and I'll just say, in the case of the Scottish project, the siting of them. We don't in the United States site projects 2 miles off of the coast. And I think any golf course developer would find it very troubling to find an offshore wind 2 miles off of their coast.
But they're
Um,
20 miles off the coast now, right?
they're 20 miles off the coast today. We do have lease areas that were leased over a decade ago that are, closer to shore. But they're certainly not anywhere within that sort of, I think that, 10 miles is the closest that we're really talking about. So just wanted to mention that the siting is very different. But yes, the technology has changed drastically. In 2009, when I was working in the governor's office and working with the Blue Water Wind Project, they were going to be using 3 megawatt turbines. Today, the sort of standard that the industry is sort of coming around is a 15 megawatt turbine. There are certainly turbines larger than that have been proposed, that's certainly in research and development, but we're really talking about 5 times the size. And that doesn't just mean it's 5 times the size, right? What it means is that you need so many fewer offshore wind turbines when you want to build a 75 megawatt wind farm, which we wouldn't build something so small. But are we really talking about, a 5 turbine project, or are we talking about a 15 turbine project? And so it's really about getting down the number of installations when we have larger turbines. And I just remember being in the governor's office and back in 2010, and we had a turbine manufacturer come in and wanted to talk to us about offshore wind, and it was really a great conversation. And he previewed a 10 megawatt turbine in 2010, and he was really talking about how many fewer installations would be needed, less economic impact, lower cost, less environmental impact. And the governor, who'd only ever been familiar with these kind of 3 megawatt projects, he thought he was crazy. He said, "You're crazy. This is all pie in the sky kind of stuff." And here we are today, at 15 megawatt turbines. So, that turbine technology, not only bigger, but they've just gotten more efficient. Obviously, as they raise in height, they're capturing wind at higher heights and higher wind speeds. Also, there have been other technological advances in things like array cables, which really have seen step changes and continued R&D. That means that when you're transmitting the electricity, you have fewer losses and then more efficiency in moving power from the wind turbines to an export cable and then to shore. So yeah, it's been very, very it's just drastically different. And, we still have so much room to grow. And that's why this continuation of the advancement of the continued global installed capacity is really so important. Because if you don't have a market to bring these kinds of changes to, then the industry won't invest in them. And what we've really seen is the confidence in the market to continue the investment in all of these really fantastic changes that we've seen.
And part of the reason that investment wants to go into this is also that the economics have improved significantly. First of all those improvements that you mentioned have reduced the costs of operations and maintenance, but there are other cost advantages, I think. Am I wrong about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're getting greater, annual energy output or, production from a turbine, you're getting more for your investment. And like I said, the fewer numbers of installations is just going to drastically decrease the cost. But also, as these wind farms have gotten much more, we're now every single wind farm in the beginning was a first of a kind. It's a first of a kind in a particular kind of geography. It's a first of a kind at a particular distance from shore. It's a first of a kind using a 5 megawatt turbine, a first of a kind using this kind of cable. And so you couldn't ever really bring down the risk profile until you started to see some standardization in the industry around these sort of technology advancements. And so if you think about the early days, and we can talk about how that the roller coaster that we've been on of the economics and the prices for offshore wind electricity. But I think really, what we've seen is that this kind of investment has really lowered the risk. We've standardized, and you can never bring the cost down when the earliest phase of an industry is really R&D. And
Right.
that's really what we were looking at when the industry was talking about it. It's building an industry. It really was still a lot of prototypes of projects.
So reduced risk means reduced costs for financing, and in
Exactly.
this case, there's billions of dollars involved. So that reduced cost of financing is a very significant factor. But you mentioned,
Especially for offshore wind, right? Especially for offshore wind. These are not projects where, you can sort of, just, self-finance these, right? These are debt-based project finance projects. And so they're very, very dependent. And at the time, that I got involved, it was the cost of capital that frankly was the most significant cost driver. So that's why there's so much of an effort to try to reduce the risk. How do we bring that down? As well as make these technology advancements. You had to do both to bring the cost down.
yeah, yeah. All right, we're running short of time. I want to get to one last question. You mentioned when Governor Markell was told what is is now happening, he called it pie in the sky. We
Yeah.
are now ready to eat our pie in the sky. What is the real potential now of offshore wind where it's able to capture more energy? It's able to go farther offshore where the winds are stronger and more consistent. What is that potential, and what has to happen for the U.S. to not overlook and bypass that opportunity, but to
Yeah.
meet
Yeah.
the opportunity? What
Yeah. I think
challenge to be
in
faced
terms
now?
of the potential, I want to sort of just loop back very briefly to the technology changes and the economic changes, because what the potential is to have large scale offshore wind cost effectively. And I think that has gotten a little bit lost in the past couple of years with the post pandemic macroeconomic headwinds and trends that really drove the price up. But we did see the price come down for offshore wind to, in the sort of 2017 to 2019 era. We were talking about Vineyard Wind at two PPAs for $74 per megawatt hour and $65 per megawatt hour. Projects really under that $100 per megawatt hour. We have the potential to have large scale offshore wind at that price again. We need to continue to see deployment for offshore wind to be able to continue to drive that. We need to see continued improvement in macroeconomic trends, interest rates, inflation, commodity prices, and we need stable policy. And so, and there are certainly signs that, albeit unevenly, interest rates are lowering in certain places. Commodity prices have come down from their 2022 peak. But we really need, to sort of see this industry stabilize in terms of those three factors. And then the potential is enormous, right? We can still get to that 40 gigawatts of offshore wind that is in the pipeline, the policy pipeline here for the United States. We can still continue to see that $130 billion of capital expenditure that would be investments in communities in the United States. We can continue to see, 2.5 or 3.5 million homes powered by offshore wind. And to do that without offshore wind, we're talking about having to develop, and build 40 new large nuclear plants. We'd have to build 100 new large natural gas plants, that are also facing the same kinds of permitting and macroeconomic headwinds as well. And so offshore wind is very, very far ahead. These are projects that are leased. These are projects that have contracts. These are projects that are already in a permitting queue. And so we need to keep moving to be able to reach this potential. And so I think those are sort of the fundamentals. But I think the last thing that I'll say here is that, what we really need to do is we need to also regain the trust of the American people. There has been a tremendous effort to sow skepticism through disinformation. And that, I'm sure, has been covered by other folks, and I won't get into that in detail. But that has also succeeded in certain places, in certain communities, in certain geographies. And it is real, and it is something that needs to be addressed across the board. But I think what we really, also know, the reality is that, and I know that some of your previous guests have been on and talked about recent polling, there is strong bipartisan support for offshore wind, here up and down the East Coast and all of our coasts on the United States. And we need to tap into that. We need to regain trust. We need to keep at it. We need to keep it bringing the cost down. And again, we know that this is a difficult political time, and that's all hard work. But as I keep saying throughout this to people who are newer to this industry that I am, it's always been hard. This has always been a hard endeavor, and we have always powered through it. And I have all the faith in the world that we'll power through and reach the potential that, again, I've really believed in this industry for the last 15 years.
Yeah, okay. Stephanie, that's all the time we have. I have to thank you so much. Stephanie McClellan, founder, executive director, strategic advisor to Offshore Wind Advocate Turn Forward, founder and former director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, who has always led that effort to power forward on this enormous resource. For our listeners, we've done podcasts. Look, as this is our closing episode in our series on offshore wind, we've done podcasts on that survey that showed that there's bipartisan support. We've talked to folks who showed that claims of harms to marine life are fallacious. Offshore wind does not kill whales. We have done a podcast on how vital offshore wind is in the planning of the entire New England independent system operator. And Stephanie McClellan has described for us the current state and potential of global and U.S. offshore wind energy, how it's grown to maturity globally, and how it can be a vital part of the U.S. energy mix. I also want to thank our sponsor, Bracewell LLP. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.